The sun hammered the back of Rip Campbell's neck. It found the gap between his sweat-stained collar and the brim of his hat and stayed there, a hot thumb pressing into his skin. The horse, under him, a bay gelding with more bone than meat, plodded with its head low, kicking up puffs of alkali dust that tasted like grit and regret. Rip shifted in the worn saddle, the leather groaning a complaint he understood. Every mile felt the same as the last. Cracked earth stretched to a hazy horizon that shimmered and danced, promising nothing but more of itself. A lone vulture circled high above, a patient black speck against a bleached blue sky. Rip watched it for a time. Somebody always eats, he thought. He ran a hand over the stubble on his jaw, the rasp loud in the silence. His canteen was low. He could feel the weight of the water, or the lack of it, sloshing with each step the horse took. 2 days ago, it had been full. 2 days ago, he told himself he'd be looking at a bunkhouse and a hot meal by now. The world had a way of not listening. He scanned the landscape, his eyes narrowed to slits. He wasn't looking for beauty. He was looking for a fence line, a windmill, the glint of a water trough, anything that meant cattle. And where there were cattle, there were men who needed help. Work. The word felt foreign in his mouth, even when he didn't say it. The last job had ended in a flash flood and the sight of a whole herd washing away down a swollen river. Taking his pay and a piece of his pride with it, he still had the boots he'd planned to replace. The sole on the left one was coming loose, making a soft flapping sound against the stirrup every now and then. The base stumbled, catching itself with a lurch that jolted Rip from his thoughts. He leaned forward and patted the horse's neck. The animal's hide was hot and slick with sweat. "Easy now," Rip said, his voice a dry crackle. It was the first time he'd spoken all day. He pulled the horse to a stop and swung down from the saddle. His knees protested. He walked a slow circle, stretching his legs, then pulled the canteen from his saddlebag. He unscrewed the cap and gave the horse a mouthful in his cupped hand before taking a small, unsatisfying swallow for himself. The water was warm and tasted of tin. It was better than nothing, not by much. He stood beside the horse and stared out at the endless brown plain. A man could die out here and no one would know for a month. The sun would bake him, the buzzards would clean him, and the wind would scatter what was left. It was a place that didn't care if you lived or died. Rip understood that. He didn't hold it against the land. It was honest, at least, more honest than most men he'd met. As the sun began to dip lower, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and purple, the heat finally started to break. The shadows of cactus and scrub brush grew long and skeletal across the desert floor. It was in that fading light that Rip saw it. Not a windmill, not a fence, just a flicker. Miles off to the east, a pinprick of orange that appeared and then vanished. He watched this spot, his body tense. It came again, stronger this time, a campfire. He capped the canteen and tied it back in place. He looked at the bay, then back at the distant light. A fire meant a man. A man meant questions, maybe a shared meal, maybe trouble. He swung himself back into the saddle. The horse didn't need to be told. It turned toward the light, its pace a little quicker now. Hope was a fool's game, but it was the only one in town. The closer Rip got, the more the fire looked like a mistake. It was too big, a bright splash of orange against the dark, visible for miles. A man who wanted to be left alone kept his fire small. A man who wanted to be found, or didn't know any better, built a blaze. R.I.P. dismounted 100 yards out and led the bay forward. The soft flap of his boots sold the only sound breaking the desert's evening hum. A figure sat hunched by the flames, poking at them with a stick. He had a scrawny rabbit sizzling on a spit. The smell of cooking meat made Rip's stomach clench. The man looked up as Rip stepped into the ring of light, his hand resting near the butt of his pistol. The man grinned, a flash of white teeth and a young, unshaven face. He didn't look much older than 20. "Evenin', figured someone would see my fire. Hoped they wouldn't be Apache." He had a fast, easy way of talking. "Get down, rest your horse. Name's Jesse. Rabbit's almost done." Rip nodded, his eyes taking in the camp. Jesse's saddle was new, the leather barely scuffed. His gear was piled neat. Too neat. Rip tethered the bay to a mesquite bush and came closer to the fire, taking a seat on a flat rock opposite the young man. "Rip," he said. "Rip, good name. A man named Rip sounds like he gets things done." Jesse gestured with the stick. "You headed somewhere, or just headed? Looking for ranch work?" "Work." Jesse laughed, a short, sharp sound. "That's the slow way to die. There's money out here, Rip, you just gotta know where to look. No calluses required." He took the rabbit off the spit and tore a leg off with his fingers, offering it to Rip. "The trick is not to work for it. The trick is to take it from the folks who already did." Rip took the piece of meat. It was greasy and hot. He ate it slow, watching Jesse. The young man's eyes never stayed still. They darted from Rip's face to his saddlebags, from his gun to his horse. "I seen a fella in Socorro," Jesse went on, chewing with his mouth open. "Wore a silk vest, had a diamond stick pin in his tie, walked out of the bank with a bag so heavy he had to use 2 hands. Now, a man like you or me, we see that and think, Good for him. But what if we thought, good for us? What if he had a shotgun rider? Rip said, his voice flat. Jesse's grin widened. Details. A man gets bogged down in details. He never does nothing. You gotta see the big picture. He wiped his greasy fingers on his pants. So what's your story? Rip, you don't look like a man who enjoys talking orders. I manage, I bet you do. Jesse's smile faded. His hand, which had been resting on his knee, drifted down toward his boot. But a man can always do better. A man with a good horse, a good gun. He's got options. He leaned forward, the firelight catching the hungry look in his eyes. Thing is, sometimes you run into another fella and you realize his options ought to be your options. It happened fast. Jesse's hand shot from his boot, not with a pistol, but with a long, thin knife. He lunged across the fire, the blade glinting. Rip threw himself backward off the rock, the rabbit leg tumbling into the dust. He hit the ground hard, the air knocked from his lungs. Jesse was on him in an instant, the knife slashing down. Rip caught his wrist, the muscles in his arm straining. Jesse was wiry but strong. His face twisted in a snarl, spitting curses. They rolled in the dirt, kicking at the fire and sending embers scattering into the night. Rip's gun was pinned under him. He twisted, bucking, trying to get free. Jesse brought his other hand up, clawing at Rip's eyes. Rip slammed the back of his head into Jesse's face. There was a wet crunch of cartilage and a scream of pain. Jesse's grip loosened for a second. It was all Rip needed. He shoved the man off, drew his pistol, and fired. The shot was a deafening crack that echoed across the plain and then vanished, leaving a ringing silence behind. Jesse lay on his back, his eyes wide open, staring at a sky full of stars he could no longer see. A dark stain spread across his chest. Rip got to his feet, breathing hard. He stood over the body for a long minute. Then he got to work. He found a watch in the man's pocket, silver and heavy, with initials engraved on the back. AC. There was a folded, sealed letter, too. He took them both. He used Jesse's own spade to dig a shallow hole in the hard-packed earth. It was a miserable job. When he was done, he rolled the body in and covered it, piling rocks on top to keep the coyotes from getting any ideas. He stood over the fresh grave in the dying firelight, the silver watch cold in his hand. He was alone again. Blackridge baked under the morning sun. The town was a single dusty street, lined with buildings that had the same tired, sun-bleached look as the hills behind them. A gust of wind sent a tumbleweed rolling past a silent blacksmith shop. Two men, sitting in the shade of the general store porch, stopped talking to watch Rip ride in. Their eyes followed him as he passed, a stranger on a tired horse, carrying the trail's dust with him. He found the sheriff's office at the end of the street, a small clapboard building with a faded sign and a single barred window. He swung down from the bay, the flap of his boot sole loud on the hard-packed dirt. He looped the reins around a hitching post and took a moment to look back the way he came. The town was quiet, too quiet. The door to the office was open. Rip stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. A man sat behind a heavy oak desk, a ledger open in front of him. He was older, with a graying mustache and weary lines around his eyes. A tin star was pinned to his vest. He didn't look up immediately, but finished writing a line with a slow, deliberate hand. "Help you," he said, finally setting the pen down. "You, the sheriff?" Rip asked. "Man with the badge usually is." The sheriff leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking. "What's your business?" Rip walked to the desk. He took the silver watch from his pocket and set it down. It made a solid clink on the wood. He placed the sealed letter beside it. "Had some trouble last night," Rip said. "Camped about a day's ride east of here. Man tried to rob me." The sheriff looked at the items on his desk, then back at Rip. He didn't touch them. "This man have a name?" "Jesse," Rip said. "Didn't get a last one. And where's Jesse now?" "Buried him." The sheriff sighed. A long, tired sound. He ran a hand over his face. "He pulled a knife, you pulled a gun. Bet the shape of it?" "That's the shape of it," Rip confirmed. "Found these on him, figured the law ought to have them, thought they might tell you who he was." The sheriff finally picked up the watch, turning it over in his calloused fingers. He studied the engraved initials, his expression unreadable. He set it down and picked up the letter, looking at the unbroken seal. He placed it carefully back on the desk. "You got a name?" the sheriff asked. "Rip Campbell." "Well, Mr. Campbell, you bring me a body, a story, and a dead man's property. That's a whole lot of trouble for a Tuesday morning." He stood up, a tall man who moved like every joint ached. "I'm Sheriff Kofi, and I'm going to have to ask you to hand over your gun." Rip hesitated for a second, then unbuckled his gun belt and laid it on the desk. The office felt suddenly hotter, smaller. "Just need to sort this out," Kofi said, his voice mild. "Ask a few questions, maybe write out and check your story. A man is dead. That means paperwork." He picked up a ring of keys from a hook on the wall. "It'll be more comfortable for you to wait here than in the saloon." He led Rip toward a short hallway with two cells. He stopped at the first one and unlocked the heavy iron door. The cell was small and smelled of stale sweat and disinfectant. A thin mattress lay on a cot. "This is necessary?" Rip asked, his voice low. "For now, it is," Coffee said, not looking at him. "A man gets killed, people get jumpy, especially around here. This is the safest place for you until I know what I'm dealing with." Rip stepped into the cell. He turned his Coffee pulled the door shut. The metal scraped against the stone floor. The lock clicked into place, a final, heavy sound that echoed in the small room. Sheriff Coffee stood on the other side of the bars for a moment, his face grim. Then he turned and walked back to his desk, leaving Rip alone with the silence. An hour passed, or maybe two. Time moved differently in a cage. Rip lay on the cot, hands behind his head, staring at the ceiling in its geography of water stains. He could hear the lazy buzz of a fly and the creak of Sheriff Coffee's chair from the front office. The town outside was a collection of distant sounds, a hammer on an anvil, the whinny of a horse, men's voices too low to make out words. Then a new sound cut through the quiet, the rattle of a carriage pulling up fast, the horses snorting as they were reined in. The front door of the office opened and closed with a soft click. A woman's voice, low and clear, said, "Sheriff, Mrs. Crowe." Coffee's voice had a different texture to it now, strained. I was about to send a deputy." "You found something," the woman stated. It wasn't a question. Rip sat up, swinging his legs off the cot. He moved to the bars of the cell, his boots silent on the stone floor. He could see them now, standing by the desk. She was dressed in a traveling dress of fine black wool, the kind of material that looked out of place and expensive against the dusty backdrop of the office. She was tall, poised, with dark hair pulled back in a severe knot. She wasn't weeping. Her face was a mask of calm control. Sheriff Coffee gestured to the desk, a clumsy, apologetic movement. "This man," he said, nodding toward the cells. "He brought these in this morning." The woman, Mrs. Crowe, stepped to the desk. She didn't look at Rip. Her attention was fixed on the silver watch and the sealed letter. She reached out with a gloved hand and picked up the watch. He turned it over, her thumb tracing the initials engraved on the back. Her hand was perfectly steady. She set the watch down and looked at the letter, but didn't touch it again. Finally, she turned her head. Her eyes, a cool, dark gray, settled on Rip. It wasn't a look of grief or anger. It was the look a rancher gives a wolf caught in a trap. "That was my son's watch," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of command. "Adam." Rip met her gaze. He said nothing. The fly buzzed past his head. "You killed him," she said, the words flat and cold as river stones. "He tried to kill me first," Rip said. She gave a slight shake of her head, a dismissal of his words, as if they were an annoyance, a sound as meaningless as the fly. She turned back to the sheriff. "I want him hanged," she said. Sheriff Coffee cleared his throat. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Ma'am, there's a process, a trial. Do you see a judge in this town, Sheriff?" Her voice sharpened, the steel beneath the velvet showing itself. "My husband built this town. My son is dead. That is the only process that matters." "Evelyn, please," Coffee started, his tone pleading. "Mr. Crowe." "He wouldn't. My husband," she cut in, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was more menacing than a shout, "is not well. I speak for the family now, and I say, this man hangs before sundown." She turned without waiting for a reply. Her back was straight, her steps measured and sure. She walked out of the office, closing the door softly behind her. The sound of her carriage pulling away filled the silence she left behind. Sheriff Coffee stood by his desk for a long moment, looking at the door. He picked up the silver watch, then set it down again. He looked over at Rip, his face a mixture of fear and resignation. "You," Coffee said, his voice barely audible, "have no idea the trouble you're in." The sun bled out of the sky, painting the bars of Rip's cell in stripes of orange and red across the far wall. The shadows in the office deepened. From his cot, Rip watched Sheriff Coffee sit at his desk, a silhouette against the window. The sheriff hadn't said a word since the woman left. He just sat there, staring at the street as the town settled in for the night. A lamp was lit in the general store across the way, its yellow light a small square in the growing dark. The hammer at the blacksmith's had gone silent an hour ago. A dog barked, was told to shut up, and did. Finally, Coffee moved. He pulled a bottle of whiskey and a single glass from a desk drawer. He poured a finger, drank it in one go, and poured another. He didn't look toward the cell. He seemed to have forgotten Rip was there. The sheriff got up and walked to the window, nursing the glass. He stood there for a long time, looking out at the town he was supposed to protect. The muscles in his jaw worked, tight and hard. He finished the second drink and went back for a third. He drank that one standing at the desk, his gaze fixed on the silver watch. He picked it up, then put it down as if it were hot. "She meant it," Coffee said to the room. His voice was rough. "Sundown, she send men." Rip didn't answer. He just watched. Coffee walked back to the cell, the whiskey bottle in his hand. He stopped a few feet from the bars. His eyes were bloodshot. "You're a convincing liar," the sheriff said, "or a man with the worst luck I've ever seen. I told you what happened, Rip said, his voice even. What happened? Coffee said with a bitter laugh. Is that Adam Crowe is dead? He was a snake, that boy, vicious and stupid. But he was her snake. He took a long swallow from the bottle, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. His father, Old Man Crowe, he'd have seen the sense in it. A fair fight's a fair fight. But he's not the one giving orders anymore. The sheriff leaned against the wall, the brick cool against his back. This town runs on Crowe money. The water in the wells, the beef on the table, everything. You think I got this job because I'm fast with a gun? He shook his head. I got it because I know which way to look when a Crowe rider wants to blow off steam in the saloon. He looked Rip in the eye. She'll hang you herself if she has to. She'll L-string you up from the signpost on the general store and leave you there for the crows to pick at. And this town will watch and do nothing, because they're afraid. And so am I. Coffee pushed himself off the wall. He walked back to his desk in the near darkness, set the bottle down with a thud, and lit a small oil lamp. The flame threw long dancing shadows that made the room feel smaller, more dangerous. He walked to the front door and slid the heavy iron bolt across. He pulled the shade down over the window. The office was cut off from the world. A small island of flickering light. Sheriff Coffee turned, the ring of keys in his hand. He walked back down the short hallway, the metal jingling softly with each step, the only sound in the suffocating quiet. He stopped in front of Rip's cell. The key scraped in the lock. It was a loud, ugly sound in the quiet office. Sheriff Coffee worked it back and forth, his knuckles white, until the bolt finally slid back with a heavy clank. He pulled the cell door open just enough for a man to slip through. It whined on its hinges. Get your things, Coffee said, his voice a low rasp. He didn't look at Rip, he looked past him, into the empty cell, as if he were talking to a ghost. Rip stood up from the cot. He didn't move toward the door. He watched the sheriff. Coffee turned and walked back to his desk. He picked up Rip's gun belt and held it out. I didn't see you, he said. You were never here. The cell was empty when I locked up for the night. Rip walked out of the cell and took the gun belt. The leather was worn and familiar in his hands. He buckled it around his waist. The weight of the Colt, a comfort. She'll send men in the morning, Rip said. When they find me gone, they'll come looking for you. That's my problem. Coffee went to the back door of the office and unlatched it. He opened it a crack, letting in a sliver of cool night air and the smell of dust and horse manure. There's a livery to Buildings Down. A drunkard named Sal runs it. He won't hear you if you're quiet. He looked at Rip then, his eyes pleading. Ride west. Don't stop. Don't look back. There's nothing for you here but a rope. What about the watch and letter? Rip asked. Evidence of a drifter who passed through town and kept going. The sheriff's face was slick with sweat in the lamplight. Now go, before I change my mind. Rip didn't thank him. He stepped past the sheriff and out into the back alley. The darkness was absolute. The moon was a sliver, hidden behind a bank of clouds. He stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, listening. Faintly, from the front of the saloon, he could hear a poorly played piano. He moved along the back of the buildings, his boots making soft sounds in the dirt. The livery stable smelled of hay and liniment. Through a grimy window, he could see a lantern turned down low, and a figure asleep on a cot. Sal, a black gelding, was tied to a rail outside the saloon. It was a good horse, well-muscled, with a deep chest. It wore a brand Rip didn't recognize. He ran a hand down its leg, checking for swelling. The horse stood quiet. He untied the reins, the leather cool in his hand. He led it down the alley, away from the faint lights of the main street. At the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open scrub, he swung himself into the saddle. The leather creaked. He nudged the gelding with his heels, and the horse broke into a steady canter, eating up the dark ground. A mile out of Blackridge, Rip pulled the horse to a stop. He turned and looked back. The town was a few scattered lights, a tiny island in a black ocean of prairie. The sheriff hadn't let him go out of kindness. A man that afraid didn't have room for kindness. He'd just pointed a gun in another direction, hoping it wouldn't be aimed at him when it went off. Rip kicked the horse, harder this time, and rode west. The air in the bedroom was thick with the smell of stale linens and expensive polish. Heavy velvet curtains, the color of dried blood, blocked out the night. A single lamp on a mahogany table cast a weak yellow circle of light around a four-poster bed. In the bed, Cyrus Crowe lay propped against a mountain of pillows, his head lolled to one side. A thin line of drool trickled from the corner of his mouth onto the starched white pillowcase. His eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling. They were the only part of him that moved. Evelyn Crowe stood at the foot of the bed, her black dress a column of shadow in the dim room. She held a damp cloth in her hands. He's gone, Cyrus, she said, her voice calm and even. She walked to the side of the bed and dabbed at his chin with the cloth. Sheriff Coffee let him out the back door. The fool probably thinks he did a good thing. Cyrus Crowe's left eyelid twitched. A low guttural sound rumbled in his chest, a broken engine trying to turn over. Don't exert yourself, Evelyn said, her tone devoid of comfort. It's been handled. She placed the cloth in a porcelain basin. Slade is here. The door opened without a knock. The other two, a big red-faced man named Boone and a quiet, wiry one called Cale, stood a pace behind him, their eyes on the floor. He got a good head start. "Ma'am," Slade said. Evelyn turned from her husband. "He's on a stolen horse, and he doesn't know the territory. You'll find him." She walked toward the men, her gaze sweeping over them. "I want him brought back. I don't want him brought back alive." Boone shifted his weight, a grin touching his lips. "For the three of you to share. And a bonus. Another 100 for the man who puts him in the ground." Slade nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. He didn't look at the money she was offering, he looked at her. "It'll be done before noon tomorrow." "See that it is," she said. The three men backed out of the room, putting their hats on as they closed the door behind them. Evelyn listened to their boots echo down the long hallway, then fade. She went to the window and pulled back the edge of the heavy curtain. Outside, three riders cut across the manicured lawn, their dark shapes stark against the starlit grass. They moved toward the open range, fanning out as they picked up speed. She let the curtain fall. The room was silent again, except for the wet, labored sound of Cyrus Crowe's breathing. She looked at the paralyzed man in the bed, a piece of furniture that still had to be cleaned and tended. "You see, Cyrus," she said to the silent room, "everything is taken care of." The sky went yellow an hour after dawn, not the warm yellow of a sunrise, but a sick, bruised color that hung on the horizon. The wind, which had been a steady whisper all night, picked up a voice. It started to howl, kicking dust devils up from the flat, cracked earth. Rip pulled his bandana up over his nose and mouth, the cheap cotton already tasting of grit. The stolen gelding didn't like it. It pinned its ears back and sidestepped, fighting the reins. "Easy," Rip muttered, his voice muffled by the cloth. He leaned forward in the saddle, squinting at the horizon. The yellow was turning to a solid brown wall, churning and growing, eating the sky. He'd seen storms like this before. They could strip paint from a barn, skin from a man. He spurred the gelding, turning it southeast, looking for a break in the terrain, anything, a gully, a rock outcropping. The world was flat and empty. The wind hit him like a fist, a solid wall of force that threatened to tear him from the saddle. Sand and pebbles stung his exposed skin, 1,000 tiny needles. The horse screamed, a high, terrified sound swallowed by the wind. It tried to bolt, to turn, and run from the noise. Rip fought it, pulling hard on the reins, his knuckles cracking against the saddle horn. He could see nothing now but a swirling brown chaos. The sun was gone. The sky was gone. There was only the wind and the sand. He let the horse have its head for a moment, trusting its instinct. The gelding stumbled down a short, steep incline, and suddenly the force of the wind lessened. They were in a dry wash, a shallow ravine carved by water that hadn't been seen in years. It wasn't much, maybe 10 feet deep, but it was shelter. Rip swung down from the saddle, his legs stiff. He pulled the horse deeper into the cut, tying its reins to a scrubby, half-dead bush. The animal stood trembling, its head low, its coat already caked in fine dust. Rip crouched down, his back against the dirt wall of the arroyo, and pulled his hat low. The wind shrieked over the top of the ravine. A constant rain of sand poured over the edge, piling up in drifts. He was in a coffin of dirt. There was nothing to do but wait. He thought about the $200 he'd lost on that cattle drive. $200 and a partner with a bullet in his gut, all because of a rustled herd and a bad decision. That money was supposed to get him to California. It was supposed to buy back a promise he'd made to a woman in dusty San Angelo, a woman named Clara. He could see her face now, clear as day, the way she looked at him when he said he was leaving. He'd told her he'd be back in 6 months, his pockets full. It had been 2 years. He ran a hand over his face, the stubble like sandpaper against his palm. 6 months. He'd had a way of making promises he couldn't keep. He wondered if she was still waiting. Probably not. A woman like Clara didn't wait long. The sound of the wind was changing, the high-pitched scream dropping to a low moan. The light was shifting. Through the haze, he could see a patch of bruised purple that might have been the sky. The storm was passing. He had lost hours, maybe half a day. He got to his feet, the grit crunching under his boots, and began to dig the sand away from the horse's legs. He had ground to cover. The air was still and heavy with dust. Rip had the gelding calm, its reins in his hand, ready to lead it up the less steep side of the ravine. He could taste the grit in his teeth. That's when he heard it. The soft clink of a horseshoe on stone. It was close. He froze, his hand dropping to the butt of his Colt. He looked up. 3 riders sat their horses on the rim of the arroyo, silhouetted against the pale, dusty sky. They looked down at him like buzzards studying a dying calf. The one in the middle, tall and slouching in the saddle, was Slade. To his right was the big one, Boone, a wide grin splitting his red face. The third man, Cale, was wiry and held himself quiet. "End of the line, Campbell," Slade said. His voice was flat, carrying easily in the dead air. Rip didn't reach for his gun, not yet. He held his hands out, away from his body. "This is a mistake. The boy pulled a knife on me." It was Boone chuckled, a low rumbling sound. "Mrs. Crowe, don't see it that way. She wants you back." He looked at Slade. Said she didn't care if he was breathing when he got there. Said there was a bonus. Shut up, Boone, Slade said, his eyes never leaving Rip. Get off the horse. We'll take you in. You take me in. I'll hang, Rip said. Your boss's wife will see to it. We all know that. That's not my concern, Slade said. Rip saw the way Boone's hand was resting on his pistol, the way his thumb was rubbing the hammer. He saw the cold certainty in Slade's eyes. They weren't there to talk. All right, Rip said, taking a slow step toward his horse. Let me just get my canteen. He moved, and so did Boone. Boone's pistol cleared leather first. The shot was loud, an explosion in the silence. The bullet kicked up dirt a foot to Rip's left. Before the echo died, Rip's Colt was out. He didn't aim at Boone. He fired at the quiet one. Cale. Cale grunted, a sharp exhalation of breath, and grabbed at his thigh. He slumped forward in his saddle, his horse dancing nervously. Slade was already moving, swinging his horse around to use it as a shield, his own gun barking. Rip dropped, rolling behind the meager cover of the dead bush he'd tied his horse to. A bullet tore through the brittle branches above his head. You son of a bitch, Boone bellowed. He wasn't looking for cover. He kicked his spurs deep into his horse's flanks, charging recklessly down the steep, scree-covered side of the arroyo. It was a fool's move. The horse's front legs buckled on the loose rock. It gave a high, terrified whinny and went down, tumbling head over heels. Boone was thrown clear. He flew through the air, a big, clumsy sack of a man, and landed headfirst on a slab of sun-baked rock at the bottom of the wash. The sound was a dull, wet crack, like a melon splitting open. He didn't move. Cale Boone. Slade was yelling, his attention split between his two men. That was all the time Rip needed. He scrambled to his feet, untied the gelding's reins in a single, desperate jerk, and swung into the saddle. He kicked the horse hard, sending it galloping down the length of the dry wash, away from the chaos. 2 more shots followed him, the bullets whining past his ear. Then nothing. He didn't look back. He just rode. The image of Boone's limp, broken body sprawled on the rocks burned into his mind. One dead fool with a knife. And now another. It didn't matter that he hadn't pulled the trigger. He was the reason. The world was shrinking, and the list of men he'd killed was growing. They rode into Blackridge just before sunset, 2 riders and a dead man. The setting sun cast long, distorted shadows that stretched out before them like accusing fingers. Slade rode in the lead, his face a mask of grim duty. Beside him, Cale swayed in the saddle, his face pale and slick with sweat. Behind them, Boone's horse followed on a lead rope. Boone himself was slung belly down over the saddle, his arms and legs dangling, swaying with the horse's every step. A man sweeping the boardwalk in front of the general store stopped, his broom still. 2 women, gossiping by the water trough, fell silent, their hands flying to their mouths. Faces appeared in windows. Doors opened a crack. Everyone watched the slow, grim procession. Slade didn't look at any of them. He kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, on the big white house at the end of the main street. He didn't ride to the sheriff's office. He rode straight to the Crowe mansion. He dismounted in the circular drive, the hooves of his horse crunching on the fine gravel. He didn't wait for a stable hand. He wrapped the reins of all 3 horses around the black iron hitching post, leaving Boone's body where it was, a grotesque package waiting for delivery. Stay here, he said to Cale. He helped the wounded man down from his horse. Cale leaned against the post, his teeth clenched, one hand pressed hard against his thigh. Slade went up the wide front steps 2 at a time and walked through the front door without knocking. Evelyn was waiting for him in the foyer. The lamps hadn't been lit yet, and the cavernous space was filled with the gray light of dusk. She stood perfectly still, a statue carved from shadow. Well, she said. Her voice was flat, without emotion. He was waiting for us, Slade said, stopping a few feet from her. He took off his hat. He laid a trap in a dry wash south of the flats. Opened fire before we even saw him. Evelyn's eyes flickered past him, toward the open door and the grim tableau outside. And Boone shot him out of the saddle, Slade said. He didn't blink, never stood a chance. Campbell rode him down and shot him as he fell. He gestured with his hat toward the door. Cale took a bullet in the leg. He's lucky to be alive. Evelyn was silent for a long moment. She walked past Slade to the doorway and looked out. She looked at Cale, sweating and pale, leaning against the post. She looked at the still, heavy shape draped over the 3rd horse. Her expression didn't change. She turned back to Slade. The look that passed between them was more than an employer and her hired gun. It was a shared secret, a silent confirmation. Her gaze was sharp, approving. She saw the lie, and she accepted it. It was the story she wanted. Get Cale to the doctor, she said, her voice a low command. Then see to Boone. I'll pay for the burial. She took a step closer to him, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender that clung to her dress. You did what you could. Her hand came up and rested on his forearm, her fingers pressing briefly. A gesture that was too familiar, too intimate. Now the whole county will be looking for him. There will be nowhere left for him to run. Slade nodded. Yes, ma'am. She withdrew her hand. Go on. He turned and walked back out into the dying light. As he stepped onto the porch, he allowed himself a small, tight smile. It vanished before he reached Cale. The door to Sheriff Wakefield's office flew open, banging against the wall. Wakefield looked up from his paperwork, his hand halfway to his coffee cup. Slade stood in the doorway. Behind him, Cale leaned against the frame, his weight off his bandaged leg. "What is this, Slade?" Wakefield said. He started to stand up. "Stay put," Slade said. He walked into the small, dusty office, his spurs quiet on the wooden floorboards. He stopped in front of the desk. Cale closed the door, shutting out the afternoon sun and leaving the room in a dim, striped light from the barred window. "I'm the law here," Wakefield said, his voice level, but his eyes darted from Slade to Cale and back again. "Not anymore," Slade said. He reached out and casually picked up the tin star from Wakefield's desk, where the sheriff had been polishing it. He tossed it from hand to hand. "Mrs. Crowe feels there's been a change in management." Wakefield's face hardened. "You let a killer go. You think she doesn't know that? You think anyone in this town doesn't know you unlocked that cell yourself?" "Doesn't matter what they know," Slade said, his voice dropping. "It matters what they're afraid of. And right now, letting Campbell ride out isn't what they're afraid of." He smiled, a cold, thin line. You're a liability. An example." Wakefield pushed his chair back and stood, his hand dropping toward, the Colt holstered at his hip. "Get out of my office." Cale moved faster than a man with a bullet in his leg had any right to. He lunged forward, grabbing Wakefield's gun hand and twisting it behind his back. The sheriff grunted in pain. Slade stepped around the desk and drove a fist into Wakefield's stomach. The air went out of him in a whoosh. They dragged him, gagging and stumbling, out of the office and into the street. The town saw the blacksmith, his hammer frozen in midair. The saloon owner, standing in his doorway with a rag in his hand. Faces appeared in the windows of the Mercantile and the hotel. No one moved. No one said a word. The gallows stood in the small square between the jail and the livery, a stark, lonely frame against the blue sky. It hadn't been used in years. Slade didn't hesitate. He grabbed the end of the dusty rope that was still coiled around the crossbeam and shook the noose loose. "You can't do this," Wakefield rasped, struggling against Cale's grip. "This is murder. This is a message," Slade said. He threw the rope over the beam, pulled the noose wide, and dropped it over Wakefield's head. He tightened it, rough and quick. Cale shoved the sheriff forward, forcing him to stand on an old wooden crate that sat beneath the gallows. Slade looked out at the silent, watching town. He met the eyes of the blacksmith, the hotel owner. He saw the curtains twitch in the upper windows. Then he turned back to the crate. He kicked it out from under Wakefield's feet. There was a snap, a sickening jolt as the rope went taut. Wakefield's body jerked once, then hung limp, swaying gently in the breeze. Slade didn't watch it swing. He turned his back on the dead man and looked at the town again, his face unreadable. He had their attention. Cale limped to his side. Without another word, they walked away, leaving the body of the law turning slowly in the afternoon sun. A warning to anyone who thought justice in Blackridge still wore a tin star. Slade walked back into the sheriff's office and didn't bother to close the door. Through the window, the body of John Wakefield turned slowly against a pale afternoon sky. The town was dead quiet. Slade went behind the desk, the wood groaning as he sat in Wakefield's chair. He put his boots up on the scattered paperwork. It felt right. Cale limped in after him, leaning against the door jamb. "Now what?" "Now we make it official," Slade said. He pulled open the top desk drawer. It was filled with old chits, a half-empty bottle of whiskey, and a tarnished tin star, the same one he'd taken off the desk earlier. He ignored it. He rummaged deeper, his fingers closing around two smaller, simpler stars. Deputy badges. He tossed one across the desk to Cale, who caught it with his good hand. Slade took the other one and pushed the pin through the fabric of his vest, right over his heart. The metal was cold. Cale did the same, his movements slow and deliberate. They didn't look like lawmen, they looked like two wolves who'd just taken over the den. "Looks good on you," Slade said without a smile. He stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. "Let's spread the word." They walked out of the jail, leaving the door open. The body still hung from the gallows. No one had dared to cut it down. They crossed the dusty street to the telegraph office. The operator, a skinny man with a green visor and ink-stained fingers, saw them coming. He was already standing when they walked in, his hands hovering over his desk as if he might need to defend himself. "Got a message to send," Slade said. He leaned on the counter, his new badge catching the light. "To every marshal's office and sheriff in the territory, you got that?" The operator swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Yes, sir. Ready when you are." Slade stared at the man until he started to sweat. "Wanted, for the murder of Boone Jessup, and for the murder of Sheriff John Wakefield." He paused. "Man by the name of Rip Campbell. 5'11", maybe 180 pounds, brown hair, scars on his left knuckles. Last seen riding a stolen bay gelding." Cale spoke up from the doorway. "Rides like he's part of the horse." Slade nodded. Add that. And a reward. $500. Dead or alive. He looked at the operator. Make that dead, it's cleaner. The operator's fingers flew across the telegraph key, the frantic clicking filling the small hot room. The message went out, a spiderweb of lies spreading across the territory, town by town. Click clack click, murderer, click dash clack, dash click. $500. Click dash clack, dash click. Dead when he was done. The operator sat back, his shirt soaked through. Send another one, Slade said. To the circuit judge in Prescott. Inform him of Sheriff Wakefield's resignation due to unforeseen circumstances. He let the words hang in the air. And inform him that Deputy Slade and Deputy Cale have assumed all duties until a replacement can be appointed. The operator typed it out, his hands shaking slightly. Good, Slade said when the room was quiet again. He pushed himself off the counter. He and Cale walked back out into the street. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows. Wakefield's body was a dark silhouette. The street was still empty. They were the only law in town. And everyone knew it. The sun was a hammer. Rip rode the bay through a landscape of cracked earth and skeletal cholla, keeping to the low ground. He moved at night when he could, but the nights were moonless and treacherous. He needed supplies. The jerky and the water he'd taken from Blackridge were long gone. He saw the homestead an hour before he reached it, a dark smudge against the horizon that slowly resolved into a sod roof and leaning walls. It was abandoned. Windows gaped like empty eyes. He circled it twice, his hand resting on his Colt, before he dismounted. The place had been picked clean by wind and scavengers, but in the dry well, he found 2 feet of murky, stagnant water. He drank it, then filled his canteen, the water tasting of dirt and rust. He was leaving when he saw the smoke, a thin gray wisp, rising from a cluster of rocks a mile east. Too small for a signal fire, small enough for one man trying not to be seen. Rip tied the bay to a dead cottonwood and went the rest of the way on foot, his pistol in his hand. The man sat with his back against a boulder, nursing a tin cup. A small fire of mesquite roots burned with almost no smoke, heating a can of beans. He was old, his face a road map of wrinkles, a dirty gray beard covering his chest. He looked up as Rip approached, his eyes calm, unsurprised. Took you long enough, the old man said. His voice was a dry rattle. Rip stopped 20 feet away. How'd you know I was here? Saw your dust an hour back. Figured you'd smell the beans. The man gestured with his cup. You ain't the law, and you ain't Crowe's men. They ride in a pack. Rip didn't move. Who are you? Nobody. Just a man trying to get to California before his bones give out. He took a sip from his cup. Whiskey. Want some? He nodded, toward a corked bottle next to him. It's the good stuff. Stole it myself. Rip hesitated, then walked closer and holstered his pistol. He sat on a rock across the fire from the old man. He took the bottle, pulled the cork with his teeth, and took a long swallow. It burned all the way down. He handed it back. Blackridge, the old man said. It wasn't a question. You got the look, like you just crawled out of a snake hole with the snake right behind you. Something like that, Rip said. Crowe's snake hole, the man grunted. He poked the fire with a stick. Been that way for years. Used to be old man Evelyn Crowe, the husband. Mean as a gutshot grizzly. He'd steal a man's land just by looking at it. Squeeze the millers out of the Cienega Valley. Best water rights in the territory. Harlan diverted the creek, starved 'em out, then bought their deed for $100. Rip stayed quiet, listening. Then the old man had his stroke. Went stiff as a board. Folks figured that'd be the end of it. The drifter took another sip of whiskey. They figured wrong. The woman, Evelyn, she's twice as mean and half as predictable. Runs the whole show now. Got her boy, the one you tangled with, doing her dirty work. Had him rustling his own father's cattle, then blaming it on nesters so she could run them off their claims. The beans started to bubble. The old man pulled the can from the fire. They say she's got one of the hired guns, Slade, warming her bed now that the old man can't. The whole damn town's on their payroll. One way or another. The drifter offered the can of beans to Rip. You look hungry. Rip took the can. It was hot. He didn't have a spoon, so he used his knife, eating the greasy beans while the old man watched, his face impassive. When he was done, Rip wiped the blade on his pants and stood up. I'm obliged, Rip said. The old man just nodded, taking his whiskey bottle back. Don't be. Just wanted to hear my own voice for a minute. He looked out at the vast, empty horizon. You keep riding. West might outrun the buzzards. You won't outrun the crows. Rip walked back to his horse. The drifter's words settled in his gut, a heavier weight than the beans and whiskey. He wasn't just a fugitive anymore. He was a loose thread in a tapestry of greed and murder he was just beginning to see. He mounted the bay and rode west, the setting sun at his back. 2 days later, the bay gelding went lame. Rip shot the horse and kept walking. The town he walked into wasn't much, just a single dusty street baking in the sun. A sign read Sonora Springs. Population 97. It looked optimistic. He had $3, a Colt with 5 rounds, and an empty stomach. He needed supplies, but the mercantile had its windows boarded up. The only sign of life was the saloon, a squat adobe building with a faded sign that just said saloon. RIP pushed through the swinging doors. The place was cool and dark. It smelled of stale beer and sweat. 3 men were at the bar, and a lone drinker sat at a table in the corner. Rip took a seat against the far wall, a spot where he could see the door and the bar. The bartender, a heavy man with a stained apron and a sour expression, came over. "Whiskey," Rip said, "and whatever you've got, that's hot." "Stew," the bartender grunted. He went back to the bar, poured a shot from a dusty bottle, and ladled a bowl of brown liquid from a pot on a cold stove. He brought them over and set them on the table with a thud. Rip slid $1 across the wood. The bartender took it and walked away. The stew was thin, with a few sad pieces of potato and stringy meat floating in it. Rip ate it slowly, making it last. He drank the whiskey in one swallow. As he set the glass down, he saw the bartender looking at him, then looking at something tacked to the wall behind the bar. It was a piece of paper, a wanted poster. Rip didn't need to read it to know what it said. He saw the bartender's eyes flick back to his face, then down to his hands. Scars on the left knuckles. The man's face went pale. He tried to look busy, wiping down the bar with a dirty rag, but his movements were stiff. He gave a slight nod to the 2 biggest men at the bar, a pair of rough-looking miners. RIP pushed his chair back an inch. He laid his other $2 on the table. He was about to stand up when the 2 miners peeled themselves off their stools and walked over. They moved to stand on either side of his table, blocking him in. "You Rip Campbell?" the bigger one asked. He had a thick neck and small, mean eyes. "Never heard of him," Rip said, not looking up from his empty bowl. "Funny," the man said. "You look just like the drawing. $500 worth of drawing." "It's a common face," Rip said. The man's partner laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Not that common. Let's see your hands, friend." Rip looked up then. Slowly, "I'm just a man trying to eat his stew." "You're done eating," the big one said. He reached for Rip's shoulder. Rip moved. He kicked the table leg hard. The table flipped up, slamming into the miner's chest, knocking the wind out of him. The stew bowl flew through the air and shattered against the wall. Rip was on his feet, grabbing the whiskey bottle he'd just emptied. He swung it in a short, brutal arc, connecting with the side of the second miner's head. The man grunted and dropped to the floor like a sack of grain. The big miner was gasping for air, clutching his chest. Rip drove a fist into his throat. The man went down, choking, his face turning purple. Rip turned to run. The swinging doors flew open. A man stood there, silhouetted against the bright street. He held a double-barreled shotgun, its twin muzzles aimed right at Rip's chest. A tin star was pinned to his vest. "That's far enough," the deputy said, his voice calm and steady. "Got a wire about you this morning. Been waiting for someone to get stupid." Rip stood in the middle of the wrecked saloon, his chest heaving. The bartender peeked up from behind the bar. The man in the corner hadn't moved. "Raise him," the deputy said. Rip slowly raised his hands. He was trapped. Again. The world was a rectangle of blue sky and jolting pain. Rip lay on his side on the hard wooden floor of the jail wagon, his hands and feet shackled. The sun beat down on the canvas cover, turning the space into an oven. Every rut and rock in the road sent a fresh wave of agony through his bruised ribs. His head throbbed where the deputy had slammed it against the saloon wall. There were 2 men on the driver's bench. He could hear their voices, a low murmur over the rattle of the wheels and the plodding of the horses. "Could have just shot him," one of them said. Younger voice, eager. "Saved us the trip. $500 ain't the same for a corpse as it is for a breathing man." The other replied, older, tired. "Slade wants him breathing. At least for a little while. Still he don't look like much. He killed Boone Jessup, and they say he's the one got the sheriff of Blackridge killed. That's enough for me." A pause, then the older one spat. "Besides, it ain't about what he looks like. It's about who wants him." The wagon hit a deep rut, and Rip's head bounced off the floor. He grunted, tasting blood. "Mrs. Crowe," the younger man said, his voice dropping a little. "She's the one put up the money. She's the one puts up all the money in Blackridge these days." The older guard said, "You ever been passed through once?" Seemed quiet. The older man laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Quiet as a graveyard. Used to be Evelyn Crowe's town. He'd snap his fingers, and the whole place would jump. Then he had that stroke last year. Left him staring at the ceiling, drooling on his pillow. I heard about that. Shame. Shame for him, maybe, not for her. She stepped right in, didn't miss a beat. Some say she's more ruthless than he ever was. The boy, the one Campbell here, shot, he was her tool. A dull one, from what I hear, but she kept him sharp enough to do her cutting." They were quiet for a while, the only sound the creaking of the wagon. Rip listened, his eyes closed, piecing it together. The woman in black. The drifter's story. It was all falling into place. "So the old man's just gone?" the young one asked. "Good as, tucked away in that big mansion of theirs. The woman runs the ranch, the town, the law. Runs Slade, too. If the whispers are true, This whole thing, the older guard said, his voice dropping low, this ain't about justice for her boy. It's about tying up loose ends and showing everyone who's in charge. We're just delivering the rope. The wagon slowed, the rattling easing as they hit the smoother dirt of a town street. Rip opened his eyes a crack. Through a gap in the canvas, he saw the familiar false front of the Blackridge mercantile. And then he saw the gallows. Stark against the afternoon sun, a dark, twisted shape still hung from the crossbeam, turning slowly in the breeze. The wagon stopped. The back flap was thrown open, flooding the space with blinding light. End of the line, Campbell, the older guard said, looking down at him. Welcome home. They didn't take him to the jail. Slade and the other deputy, Cale, dragged Rip from the wagon and hauled him up the street, past the silent storefronts and the gallows. They went up a wide, dusty path, toward a two-story house that sat on a low hill, looking down on the town like a hawk on a rat. The house was big, with a wide porch and tall windows, but the white paint was peeling. One of the shutters hung by a single hinge. Slade shoved Rip up the steps and through the front door without knocking. The inside was dark and cool. It smelled of dust and something medicinal. A grandfather clock stood silent in the hallway, its pendulum still. Slade pushed Rip down the hall and into a large room on the right. Evelyn Crowe stood by the window, looking out at the town below. She wasn't wearing the black dress anymore. She had on a simple gray riding skirt and a white blouse. She didn't turn as they came in. Leave him, she said. Slade shoved Rip forward, making him stumble to his knees on a threadbare Persian rug. Then he and Cale stepped back out of the room, closing the heavy oak doors behind them. The click of the latch was loud in the silence. Get up, Mr. Campbell, Evelyn said, her voice flat. She turned from the window. Her eyes were cold, without a trace of the tears he'd seen in the jail. I want you to see something. Rip got to his feet. His body ached. He followed her gaze to a massive four-poster bed that took up most of the far wall. A man lay in it, propped up on a mountain of pillows. His head was lolled to one side, a thin line of spittle tracing a path from the corner of his mouth to his collar. His eyes were open but saw nothing. One hand lay on the quilt, the fingers twitching in a slow, constant rhythm. The only sound he made was a soft, wet gurgle with each breath. This is Harlan Crowe, Evelyn said, her voice conversational, as if she were introducing a guest at a party. The man who built Blackridge, the man everyone fears. Rip looked from the twitching figure in the bed to the woman standing beside it. He said nothing. He had a stroke a year ago, she went on, stepping closer to the bed. She picked up a cloth from the nightstand and wiped the man's chin with a practiced, impatient motion. It left him like this, a body in a bed, a ghost in his own house. She tossed the cloth back on the nightstand. But a useful ghost, a name that still carries weight. His name signs the deeds. His name is on the banknotes. His name keeps the town in line. Your name, Rip said. His voice was a dry rasp. A flicker of something, not a smile, but an acknowledgement touched her lips. I do the signing. I make sure the ink flows. My son was supposed to help with that. He was simple, but he was loyal. His job was to make life difficult for the nesters on the South Range, convince them to sell. Instead, he got greedy. He saw a lone rider and thought he'd found an easy score. She looked directly at Rip. He was a fool. His death was an inconvenience. But you, Mr. Campbell, you are an opportunity. A murderer on the loose is a wonderful excuse to tighten a grip. To hang a sheriff who asks too many questions. To show everyone what happens when you cross the Crowe name. She walked to the door and opened it. Slade was standing right outside, waiting. You see, Evelyn said, her voice dropping, it was never about my son, it was always about this town. He was a piece in the game, and so are you. She nodded to Slade. Put him in the cell next to the old lawman's office. Let him think about it until morning. Slade grinned, showing yellow teeth. He grabbed Rip's arm in a vice grip and dragged him out of the room, leaving Evelyn Crowe alone with the twitching, gurgling man in the bed. Slade shoved Rip into the cell. It was the same one Sheriff Wakefield had put him in, only now it smelled of stale sweat and fear. The iron door slammed shut, the sound echoing in the small building. The bolt slid home with a grating finality. Rip went to the cot and sat down. Through the bars, he could see the sheriff's office. The chair was on its side, a ledger splayed open on the floor like a broken bird. He sat there for an hour, maybe two. The sun went down, and the office filled with shadows. Then he heard the front door open. Footsteps, two sets. One heavy, one light. Evelyn Crowe and Slade walked in. She carried a lantern, holding it high. The light threw their shadows, huge and distorted, against the far wall. They stopped in the middle of the office, not looking at Rip. Cale is watching the mansion, Slade said. His voice was low, intimate. He reached out and brushed a piece of straw from her sleeve. His fingers lingered on her arm. And the town? Evelyn asked. She didn't pull away. Scared. Just how you like it. Good. She finally turned her head, and the lantern light caught her eyes. They were fixed on Rip's cell. Tomorrow, she said, her voice cutting through the quiet. At sunrise, use the other side of the gallows. I want them hanging side by side. Slade smiled, a slow predator's grin. Been a while since we had a double header. He left her side and walked over to a hook on the office wall where a new coil of rope was hanging. He took it down, the hemp stiff and yellow in the lantern light. He brought it to the sheriff's desk, tossed it down, and started working. His thick fingers moved with a surprising dexterity, looping and pulling, twisting the rope into the 13 coils of a hangman's knot. He didn't take his eyes off Rip the entire time. This one's special, Slade said, holding up the finished noose. Fresh off the spool. Guaranteed not to snap. Rip didn't say a word. He watched Slade's hands. He watched the way Evelyn stood, her back straight, watching both of them. He saw the current that passed between them, not passion, but a shared appetite for power. A partnership of wolves. Leave it, Evelyn said. She turned to go. Slade dropped the noose on the desk, right next to the dead sheriff's inkwell. It sat there, a coiled snake, ready to strike. He followed Evelyn to the door. Don't get too comfortable, he said over his shoulder to Rip. Morning comes fast. The door closed. The bolt slid home again. Rip was alone in the dark, the only light a pale sliver of moon coming through the high, barred window. He could hear the wind outside, a low moan that made the sign on the mercantile across the straight creek. On the desk, the noose held its perfect, deadly shape. The moon disappeared behind a cloud. Rip lay on the cot, listening to the creak of the mercantile sign and the skittering of a mouse in the wall. He wasn't waiting for morning. He was watching the noose on the desk, a pale shape in the gloom, and thinking. Then he smelled it. Wood smoke, not the clean scent of a hearth, but the acrid smell of old timber and hay catching fire. A man shouted somewhere down the street. Then another, the sound of running boots on the hard-packed dirt, heading away from the jail. A faint orange glow began to flicker against the far wall of the office, dancing through the window bars. Rip stood up. He moved to the cell door, gripping the bars. He could see the light growing stronger, casting long, wavering shadows. The shouts grew louder, more frantic. Fire. At the livery he heard footsteps coming toward the jail, heavy and hurried. The front bolt was thrown, and the door crashed open. It was Cale, the younger deputy. His face was flushed, his eyes wide in the firelight. He smelled of whiskey. Slade's orders, Cale panted, fumbling a ring of keys from his belt. Got to move you. The whole damn stable's going up. He found the key and jammed it in the lock. It scraped, and the lock clicked open. Cale pulled the cell door wide. Get out. Now. He had his pistol drawn, but he held it loosely, his attention divided between Rip and the growing chaos outside. Rip stepped out of the cell. He didn't look at Cale's gun. He looked at Cale's eyes. They were fixed on the street, watching the flames lick the sky. Is it bad? Rip asked, his voice low. The whole back wall is gone, Cale said, distracted. Sparks everywhere. That was enough. Rip moved. He drove his shoulder hard into Cale's chest, slamming him back against the open cell door. The deputy's head hit the iron bars with a hollow thud. His gun clattered to the floor. He slid down the bars and lay still. Rip scooped up the pistol, a Colt Peacemaker, and checked the load. He took the gun belt, strapping it on. He was at the office door when it flew open again, hitting the wall with a crack. Slade stood there, silhouetted against the orange blaze from the street. His face was a mask of fury. He saw Cale on the floor, then his eyes locked on Rip, on the gun in Rip's hand. Slade didn't reach for his own pistol. He charged. He hit Rip like a runaway bull, driving him back across the office. They crashed over the sheriff's desk. The coiled noose and the inkwell went flying. Slade's hands were on Rip's throat, thick fingers digging in, cutting off his air. Rip fought for leverage, twisting his body, the edge of the desk digging into his spine. He couldn't aim, he couldn't breathe. He brought the Colt up, jamming the barrel hard into Slade's soft belly. The shot was a flat, muffled hump, absorbed by flesh and flannel. Slade grunted, a sound of pained surprise. His grip loosened. He took a staggering step back, looking down at his stomach. A dark stain was already spreading across his shirt. He looked up at Rip, his mouth open, but no sound came out. Rip didn't wait to hear it. He scrambled over the wrecked desk and ran out the door, into a world of smoke and shouting men. He turned the opposite way from the fire, down a dark alley between the mercantile and the assayer's office, and disappeared into the night. The alley was a narrow gut of darkness between two-story buildings. It stank of trash and stale beer. Rip kept one hand on the rough brick wall, his breath coming in ragged bursts. The shouts and the glow of the fire were behind him, a chaotic backdrop to the sudden quiet of the alley. At the far end, a door stood ajar in the back of the mercantile. A thin line of yellow lamplight seeped from the crack. He pushed it open. The room was a cramped office, filled with ledgers and stacks of invoices impaled on nails. A pot-bellied stove in the corner was cold. Past the office, the main store was a cavern of shadows, shapes of barrels and counters and shelves that reached to the ceiling. A man sat at the desk, a green visor on his bald head, scratching at a ledger with a steel nib pen. He didn't look up. Rip stepped inside, the Colt still in his hand but held low, pointed at the floorboards. The door clicked shut behind him. The man's head snapped up. He was old, with a face like a dried apple and wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose. His eyes widened when he saw the gun. "Don't," was all he managed. His voice a dry whisper. "I'm not here to rob you," Rip said. "Just need a place to lie low." The storekeeper, Silas, swallowed hard. He looked from Rip's face to the gun and back again. He licked his lips. "The fire. They'll be looking for you. Let them look." Rip gestured with the Colt. "You got whiskey?" Silas nodded, pushing his chair back slowly. In the front, for medicinal purposes, he stood up, hands held halfway up, palms out. "You're bleeding." Rip glanced down at his arm. A long, shallow gash ran along his forearm, a gift from the splintered edge of the sheriff's desk. It was weeping blood onto his sleeve. "And a bandage," Rip said. Silas led the way into the dark store. He moved behind the long counter and pulled a brown bottle and a small glass from a shelf. He poured a finger of amber liquid and pushed it across the counter. Then he retrieved a roll of gauze and a tin of salve from a drawer. "Heard what you did to Slade," Silas said, not meeting Rip's eyes. He pushed the bandages across the counter. "Can't say many will miss him." Rip said nothing. He took the whiskey and drank it in one swallow. It burned a trail down his throat. He started wrapping the gauze tightly around his arm. "They'll tear this town apart looking for you," Silas went on, polishing the counter with a rag. "Evelyn Crowe. She won't let this go. She'll have to find me first." Rip finished the bandage. "I need a place to wait till things quiet down." Silas stopped polishing. He looked around the dark store as if seeing it for the first time. The storeroom. In the back, no one ever goes in there but me. He gestured with his head. "You can see the alley from the window. Just don't make any trouble for me, mister." "No trouble," Rip said. Silas led him back past the office to a heavy wooden door. He pulled it open, revealing a space cluttered with crates and sacks of flour. It smelled of dust and mice. "Wait in here. I'll go out front. Make sure no one's coming. Lock the front door." Rip stepped inside. Silas started to close the door, then paused. "For what it's worth," he whispered, "good luck." The door closed, and Rip was in near total darkness. He found a small grimy window. It looked out on the alley. He waited. A few minutes later, he heard the faint jingle of the bell on the front door of the store. He thought he heard footsteps, quick and light, on the boardwalk outside, heading away. He waited some more. The silence stretched. Too long. Silas should have been back. Rip cracked the storeroom door open. The office was empty. The lamp was still lit on the desk. He crept into the main store. It was dark and silent. The front door was unlocked. He peered through the big front window, staying in the shadows. The street was empty. Most of the town was still down by the livery, watching the last of the fire. Then he saw it. A figure, small and hunched, scurrying across the street from the direction of the jailhouse. It wasn't Silas, it was Cale, the deputy Rip had left on the floor. He wasn't running. He was walking, his gun drawn, his head turning, scanning the storefronts, and he was heading straight for the mercantile. Rip didn't wait for the bell on the mercantile door to jingle. He slipped back through the office, into the storeroom, and out the rear door into the alley's thick darkness. He flattened himself against the cold brick wall, listening. He heard the front door open. Cale's voice, sharp with an edge of panic. "Silas, you in there?" A muffled reply from the storekeeper. "You seen him?" Cale demanded. "The killer, Campbell. He was headed this way." "Haven't seen a soul." Silas's voice was thin, reedy. "Been doing my books all night. What with the fire and all." "He shot Slade," Cale said, his voice dropping. "Gut shot him. He's dead." A long silence. Rip held his breath. He heard boots scuffing on the floorboards, moving through the store. He eased his way down the alley, away from the back door, deeper into the shadows. "Well, he ain't in here," Cale said, his voice closer now, near the back of the store. "If you see him, you fire 2 shots. You hear me? 2 shots." Silas repeated, his voice faint. The back door of the mercantile creaked open. Cale stood silhouetted against the lamplight for a moment, his pistol held ready. He scanned the dark alley. Rip was just a deeper shadow among the trash barrels and crates 20 yards away. Cale saw nothing. He grunted in frustration, closed the door, and Rip heard his footsteps heading back toward the front of the store. A moment later, the bell jingled again. Rip waited. He gave it 5 minutes, then crept to the end of the alley. He peered around the corner. The street was empty again. The glow from the livery fire had died to a dull red pulse against the clouds. He looked toward the jail. A single lamp burned in the office window. He crossed the street, moving like a ghost from one deep shadow to the next, until he was crouched in the narrow space between the assayer's office and the hotel, directly across from the jail. He could hear voices from the open office door. Cale was there, and another man Rip didn't recognize. "She wants him hanging by sunrise," the new voice said. It was coarse, gravelly. "Beside Wakefield, we have to find him first," Cale said. He sounded young and scared. "He could be halfway to the border." "He's not," the man said. "He's hurt, and he's on foot. He's holed up somewhere in this town. We'll find him when the sun comes up." Get a dozen men, comb every building, and then Cale asked. Then we have a trial, the man said, and laughed. It was a short, ugly sound, a quick one. Judge Miller knows what to do. He'll be tried, convicted, and sentenced before breakfast is cold. Evelyn wants it done, legal-like. The two men stepped out onto the boardwalk, their forms dark against the lamplight. I'm going to get a drink, the gravelly-voiced man said. You stay here. Keep an eye out. What if he shows up? Don't be a fool. He's not going to walk in the front door. Just watch the street. The man walked off toward the saloon. Cale stood on the boardwalk for a long time, looking up and down the empty street. He walked to the end of the porch, then back. Finally, he looked over at the saloon, then back at the dark jail. He spat into the dust, then walked quickly across the street, disappearing into the saloon's swinging doors. The jail was empty. Rip didn't hesitate. He ran across the street, silent as smoke, and slipped around to the back of the building. The single window on the rear wall was barred, but the glass was gone, shattered sometime in the past. He gripped the bars, tested them. They were set deep in the wood. He pulled Cale's Colt, using the butt of it to hammer at the sun-rotted wood of the window frame. The noise was shockingly loud in the quiet night, but he worked fast, splintering the frame around the lower bar. He chipped and hammered until he could bend the iron bar up just enough to squeeze through. He dropped to the floor inside a cell. Not his cell, the one next to it. The air was stale, cold. The office door was ajar. He crept out. The lamp on the desk cast a warm, steady glow. He went behind the desk. He remembered Wakefield taking his gun belt. He started pulling drawers open. The first held papers. The second, a bottle of whiskey. In the bottom drawer, he found it. His gun belt coiled like a snake. His Colt, its worn wooden grip, feeling like an old friend's handshake. And beside it, a smaller Remington pocket pistol he'd kept in his saddlebag. They'd taken everything. He strapped the belt around his waist, the familiar weight settling on his hips. He checked the loads in both guns, the cylinders clicking softly in the quiet room. He holstered the Colt and tucked the Remington into the front of his belt. He was armed. He was trapped. He stood in the silent office, the lamplight carving his face out of the shadows. A man with two guns, in a town that had already built his gallows. Rip didn't stay in the jail. He slipped back out the broken window, the splintered wood scraping his back, and dropped into the alley. The moon was a sliver, offering no light. He was a shadow, moving through shadows. He needed to get off the street. The swinging doors of the saloon burst open, spilling yellow light and drunken laughter into the street. Cale stumbled out, a bottle in his hand. He took a long drink, then wiped his mouth with the back of his sleeve. He looked up and down the street, trying to look like a man on watch, then started back toward the jail. Rip flattened himself in a recessed doorway as Cale passed. The deputy walked to the jailhouse door, paused, then went inside. Rip waited. He counted to 60. A shout from inside the jail, a crash, like a chair being kicked over. Then Cale was back at the door, his face pale in the lamplight spilling from the office. He was here, he yelled, to no one. He got his guns. Cale ran off the boardwalk and into the street, his head whipping back and forth. He looked toward the saloon, then the hotel. Then his eyes settled on the black maw of the alley Rip had just left. Rip drew his Colt. He didn't move. Cale drew his own gun and crept toward the alley, his boots crunching softly in the dust. Campbell, he yelled, his voice cracking. I know you're in there. Come on out. Silence. It's over, Cale said, taking another step. He was at the mouth of the alley now, peering into the darkness. Evelyn Crowe just wants to talk to you. That's all. Rip could see the deputy's gun hand shaking. The kid was lying, and he was bad at it. Throw your guns out, Cale said, his voice gaining a false layer of confidence. Throw him out, and you won't get hurt. Rip stayed quiet. He could smell the whiskey on Cale's breath from 10 feet away. I'm coming in. Cale took a hesitant step into the darkness. Don't. Rip's voice was low, flat. It came from the shadows to Cale's right. Cale jumped, spinning toward the sound. He brought his pistol up. He fired a wild shot that sparked off the brick wall a foot above Rip's head. The roar of it was deafening in the narrow space. Rip fired once. The flame from his Colt lit the alley for a split second. He saw Cale's face, the eyes wide with surprise. A small, dark hole appearing on his shirt, just over his heart. Cale didn't make a sound. He just folded, his gun clattering on the hard-packed dirt. He fell and was still. Rip stayed in the doorway, listening. The gunshot would bring the whole town running, but no one came. The laughter from the saloon hadn't even stopped. One gunshot in Blackridge at night was just the punctuation at the end of a drunk's sentence. He stepped over to the body. Cale looked like a boy who'd fallen asleep in his clothes. Rip felt nothing. No, that wasn't right. He felt tired. He felt the sting on his left side and looked down. A hot line of pain seared his ribs. Cale's wild shot hadn't been so wild after all. Shards of brick had flown like shrapnel, and one had opened a deep, bleeding cut along his side. It wasn't a bullet, but it was bad enough. He was leaving a trail. He looked down at the dead deputy. He'd killed 2 men sent after him. He'd shot a third. He was bleeding in an alley in a town that wanted him dead. He wondered if this was what it felt like to be the wolf. He pushed the thought away. It didn't matter. He had to keep moving. The Crowe mansion was at the end of the street, a dark shape against the hills. Lights burning in a few of its windows. It was the only place left to go. Rip moved along the backs of the buildings, using the deep shadows where the moon couldn't reach. He pressed a piece of his torn shirt against the wound in his side. It was a wet, sticky cold that seeped through his fingers. The Crowe mansion sat on a low hill at the edge of town, a sprawling 2-story silhouette with a few squares of yellow light cutting into the darkness. He left the town behind, crossing a patch of open ground to a low stone wall that bordered the property. He vaulted it, landing softly on manicured grass. The place was too quiet. No dogs, no guards, just the wind whispering through the branches of cottonwood trees. He circled the house. A porch wrapped around the front, dark and empty. In the back, he found the service entrance, a heavy door next to a woodpile. He tried the handle, locked. He followed the wall to a tall dark window. It looked like a study or a library. He took out the Remington, its shorter barrel, easier to handle, and used the butt to tap the corner of a glass pane. It made a sharp crack. He tapped it again, and a small triangle of glass fell inward, tinkling softly on a wooden floor. He reached inside, fumbled with the latch, and pushed the window open. He slid inside, landing in a crouch. The room smelled of old paper and leather and stale cigar smoke. Moonlight filtered through the windows, tracing the shapes of leather-bound books on shelves that reached the ceiling. A massive desk sat like a dark beast in the center of the room. Rip stood motionless, listening. From somewhere upstairs, a floorboard creaked. He moved out of the library and into a long, dark hallway. A grandfather clock stood against one wall, its pendulum a silent, unmoving brass disc. A wide staircase with a polished banister swept upward into deeper darkness. He took the stairs, one at a time, his boots making no sound on the thick runner. At the top of the landing, the hallway stretched in 2 directions. A line of light shone from under a door at the far end to his right. He headed for it. As he approached, he heard a woman's voice, soft and tired. "A servant. Rest now. I'll be back in an hour." Rip froze, pressing himself into the shadows of an alcove across the hall. The door opened. A young woman in a plain dress came out, carrying a tray with a bowl and a spoon. She didn't look his way. She closed the door quietly and padded down the hall in the opposite direction, her footsteps fading. Rip waited until he couldn't hear her anymore. He crossed the hall and put his hand on the doorknob. It was warm. He turned it slowly and pushed the door open. The room was large, dominated by a 4-poster bed. A single oil lamp on a bedside table cast a flickering, sickly yellow light. The air was thick with the smell of liniment and decay. And in the bed, propped up on a mountain of pillows, was Evelyn Crowe. This was the man whose name was a threat, the Iron Fist of Blackridge. He was a shrunken thing, a skeleton draped in wrinkled skin. One side of his face sagged, his eye drooping, his mouth slack and wet with drool that stained the collar of his nightshirt. His hands, thin and spotted, lay on the quilt. One of them twitched, his one good eye fixed on Rip. There was no fear in it, no recognition, just a flat, vacant stare. Rip stepped closer to the bed, the Colt now in his hand. "Crowe," he said, his voice a low rasp. Evelyn Crowe's mouth moved. A sound came out, a wet, garbled noise. "God, your son tried to rob me," Rip said, standing over the bed. "He pulled a knife. I killed him, you know that." The good eye blinked. The twitching hand made a feeble, spidery motion on the quilt. The gurgling sound came again, louder this time, a string of drool connecting his lip to the nightshirt. Rip looked at the pathetic figure in the bed. This wasn't a confrontation, it was like talking to a ghost. The power in this house wasn't here, it was somewhere else, walking and breathing. "Your wife sent men after me," Rip said, more to himself than to the invalid. "She had the sheriff hanged. She runs it all, doesn't she?" Evelyn Crowe rasped, his eye now wide, a flicker of something terror rage. Rip couldn't tell, passing through it. He tried to lift his head from the pillow, a shudder running through his frail body. The effort was too much. He fell back, a rattling sigh escaping his lips. Rip stood there in the quiet, sick-smelling room. He had come here for a reckoning. To face the man at the center of the web, he had found nothing. Just a dying old man in a bed, trapped in a broken body. He heard a floorboard creak in the hallway outside the door. Rip didn't turn. He shifted his weight, moving the barrel of the Colt from the man in the bed to the open doorway. The floorboard creaked again, closer this time. The door swung inward without a sound. Evelyn Crowe stood there. She wasn't the woman in black from the jailhouse. She wore a silk dressing gown, the color of cream, that hung loosely on her frame. Her hair was down, a dark cascade over her shoulders. The grief was gone from her face. In its place was something cold and hard, and in her hand she held a silver derringer. It was a small gun, a toy, but it was pointed directly at Rip's chest. "I wondered if you were smart enough to come here," she said. Her voice was the same, a low whisper, but the steel edge was all that was left. Rip didn't answer. He held his position, a statue of tense muscle between the dying man and the woman with the gun. She took a step into the room, letting the door swing shut behind her. "Did you think he could help you?" She flicked her eyes toward the bed, a look of pure contempt on her face. "He can't even feed himself." The invalid, Harlan, made a gurgling sound. His one good eye darted between Rip and his wife. "He knows," Rip said. "I told him about your son." Evelyn laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. "My son? You mean the fool who thought he could rob a man like you with a skinning knife?" She shook her head, a small, sad gesture that held no sadness at all. "Lucas was always a disappointment. Weak, like his father has become." "You sent him to rob me," Rip said. "It wasn't a question. I sent him to collect a debt," she corrected, her voice sharp. "From a man who was supposed to be passing through on the stage. Lucas was supposed to get the money and bring it back. No fuss. But the stage was late, and Lucas was impatient. He saw you by your fire. Saw a lone man with a good horse. He got greedy." Rip watched her, the pieces clicking into place. The engraved watch. The letter. It wasn't about a robbery gone wrong. It was about family business. "He was bringing you money your husband didn't know about," Rip said. "My husband doesn't know much of anything anymore," Evelyn said, her eyes like chips of ice. "This ranch, this town, it was falling apart. I've spent the last year holding it together. Making the deals he was too sick to make. Collecting the money he was too weak to demand. Lucas was supposed to be a part of that. My part." The invalid groaned, a long mournful sound from deep in his chest. His twitching hand balled into a fist on the quilt. "He knows," Evelyn said, looking at her husband with a strange mix of pity and disgust. "He understands every word. Don't you, Harlan?" Rip felt the tension in the room twist tighter. He was in the middle of a war he hadn't known existed. A war fought in whispers and back alleys, with this sick room as its silent battlefield. "You had Wakefield hanged," Rip said. "He let you go," she replied, as if explaining the simplest thing in the world. "He was a loose end. Slade was supposed to handle you." Another disappointment. She took another step into the room. The small silver gun in her hand did not waver. "It all got so messy. All because of you. All you had to do was die in that arroyo." "I'm hard to kill," Rip said. "Everyone dies," Evelyn said, "and you will die here, in this room. The man who broke into our home and murdered my husband in his bed. A tragic end to a long illness." She smiled then, a thin bloodless line. "It's a cleaner story." She raised the derringer, centering the small barrel on his face. The silver derringer was steady in her hand. The small dark hole of the barrel looked like the period at the end of a sentence. Rip didn't wait for her to finish it. He moved, not toward her, but to the side, a violent lunge that upended the small bedside table. The oil lamp crashed to the floor, glass shattering, the flame hissing out as it hit the braided rug. The room plunged into near total darkness, the only light a pale gray rectangle from the window. The derringer fired. A pop, small and sharp, and a flash of orange that illuminated her face for a split second. Her features twisted in a snarl. The bullet went wide, thudding into the thick wood of the headboard. Rip was on her before she could fire again. He slammed his hand down on her wrist. The bones were delicate, like a bird's. He twisted. She cried out, a sound of pain and fury, and the derringer clattered onto the floorboards, skittering away into the shadows. She fought. She was all sharp angles and desperation, kicking at his shins with bare feet, clawing at his face with her free hand. Her nails raked his cheek, drawing hot lines of blood. He grunted, shoving her back against the wall. The silk of her dressing gown was slippery under his hands. "You fool," she hissed, her breath hot against his face. She stopped struggling. Her body went soft against his. She looked up at him in the dim light, her eyes wide, her lips parted. "You don't have to do this. We don't have to be enemies." Her free hand came up, not to claw, but to touch his chest. Her fingers traced a line down his shirt. "Slade is gone. The town, it needs a strong hand. You're strong. I see that." R.I.P. looked down at her. He could smell her perfume, a scent of night flowers and whiskey. It was a cloying, false smell in the stale, sick air of the room. He didn't move, didn't speak. "We could run it together," she whispered, her voice turning husky. "Think of it. Everything you could want. Money, power." Her hand slid lower. "Me," Rip shoved her away. Hard, she stumbled back, hitting the wall with a gasp. The seduction vanished from her face, replaced by pure, uncut hatred. Her eyes darted around the dark floor, searching. They found it, a glint of silver near the leg of the bed. She lunged for the derringer. Rip's Colt was already in his hand. He didn't aim, he pointed. The shot was a deafening roar in the confines of the bedroom. It was loud and ugly and final. Evelyn Crowe stopped. She was on her hands and knees, reaching. Her hand froze, inches from the silver gun. She made a small sound, a sigh, as if she were suddenly very tired. Then she slumped forward, her cheek hitting the floorboards with a soft thud. Her dark hair spilled around her head, and she was still. Rip stood over her, the smell of gunpowder thick in his throat. From the bed, a new sound began. A low rhythmic choking. Evelyn Crowe was weeping. The weeping was a wet, ragged sound in the sudden silence. It came from the bed, a series of choked, rhythmic sobs. Rip stood in the dark, the smell of gunpowder stinging his nose, and looked from the still shape of Evelyn on the floor to the twitching figure under the quilt. He moved to the bed. Evelyn Crowe's one good eye was wide, locked on Rip, and tears streamed from it, carving a clean path through the grime on his cheek. His mouth worked, but only the broken sobs came out. Rip looked around the room. He needed something. Proof. Words on paper. He saw a small writing desk in the corner, its surface cluttered with bottles of tonic and stacks of linens. He strode over, found a leather-bound journal and a fountain pen. He ripped a blank page from the back of the journal. He brought the page and the pen back to the bed. He uncapped the pen and tried to place it in Harlan's twitching right hand. The fingers were stiff, curled into a claw. Rip had to pry them open. They were cold. He wrapped the old man's fingers around the pen. "You're going to write," Rip said, his voice low and flat. He took the paper and held it on the quilt in front of Harlan's hand. "You understand me?" "I know you do." Harlan's eyes stared, wide with terror. He sobbed, a sound like a drowning man fighting for air. "Your son," Rip said, pressing the pen's nib to the paper. He held Harlan's wrist, forcing the hand to move. The first stroke was a spidery, uncontrolled slash across the page. "Lucas," he had a knife. "Write it." He guided the hand. The pen shook, spattering ink. The letters were jagged, almost illegible. A child's scrawl. Lucsthe, hand spasmed. Rip held it firm. "He tried to rob me. Evelyn sent him. Your wife. Write her name." The sobs grew louder, more frantic. Harlan's body shuddered under the quilt. Rip felt the frail bones of his wrist tremble. He pushed the hand across the page again. "Evelyn. She sent Slade." Rip said she had Wakefield hanged. "For letting me go." "Write it." Wakefield the pen, scratched and tore at the paper. Harlan's breath was a ragged wheeze. Rip could feel the life draining out of the man, a current fading under his fingertips. He held the wrist tighter, his own knuckles white. The pen stopped. The old man's head lolled to the side. His eye rolled up, showing the white. "Not yet," Rip hissed. He gave the hand a hard shake. "One more thing. Tell them it was self-defense. Me. Write my name, Campbell. Clear me." He forced the hand back to the paper. The effort was immense, like trying to move a rock. The pen trembled over the page. A C, then an A. Harlan's whole body went rigid. A long, rattling groan escaped his lips. His back arched, lifting him an inch off the pillows. His fingers went limp. The pen fell from his grasp, leaving a final, dark blot of ink on the page. And then he collapsed back onto the pillows. The weeping stopped, the wheezing stopped. The room was utterly silent, except for the sound of Rip's own breathing. He looked down at the paper. It was a mess of spattered ink and broken words. Luke's, Evelyn, walk, and the beginning of his own name. It wasn't a confession, it was a riddle. He heard a shout from somewhere outside the house. A man's voice, distant but clear. The sound of running feet on the gravel drive. Someone had heard the shot. Rip snatched the paper, folded it, and shoved it in his pocket. He was alone in a room with two fresh bodies and a half-truth that was as good as a lie. The window in Harlan's sick room overlooked the back of the house. A steep, overgrown slope that tumbled down into darkness. Rip didn't bother with the stairs or the hallways. He swung a leg over the sill, dropped into a thicket of overgrown rose bushes, and ignored the thorns that tore at his clothes and skin. He moved through the night, a shadow slipping between other shadows. The sounds from the front of the house grew fainter shouts, a woman screaming, the heavy thud of boots on the porch. He didn't look back. The town below was a scatter of yellow lights and a pool of black ink. He made his way down the hill, circling wide around the main road, and entered Blackridge from the east, where the livery still stank of smoke and wet ash. The streets were mostly empty now, the excitement of the fire having burned itself out. He needed a place to think, a place with walls and whiskey. The swinging doors of the Golden Slipper Saloon were closed, but a line of light still glowed from under them. Rip pushed one open and stepped inside. The place was nearly deserted. The bartender, a man with a thick neck and a thicker mustache, was wiping down the long bar with a damp rag. Two men sat at a back table, hunched over a game of cards, their voices a low murmur. Neither of them looked up. Rip walked to the far end of the bar, the spot deepest in shadow, and sat on a stool. The bartender ambled over. He put both hands on the bar and looked at Rip. He didn't look surprised. His face was a mask of practiced neutrality. "Whiskey," he said. It wasn't a question. Rip nodded. The bartender poured a shot from a bottle with no label and pushed the glass toward him. "Heard the news," he said, his voice low. He didn't look at Rip, just kept wiping the same spot on the bar, over and over. "Wrench hand came down a few minutes ago. Said he found them." Rip said nothing. He wrapped his hand around the glass but didn't drink. The front doors swung open again. A cattle buyer Rip had seen around town, A man named Henderson, with a face like a slab of raw beef, strode in. He looked around, his eyes wide and excited. "You here?" he boomed, walking toward the bar. Both of them, the old man and Evelyn, shot dead. The two card players finally looked up from their game. One of them, a skinny freighter, whistled low. "Jesus, who did it?" "Who do you think?" Henderson said. "He slapped the bar. That fella Campbell, the one Slade was hunting." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The ranch hand said the old man was shot in his bed, unarmed. The bartender stopped wiping. "That's the story, is it?" "It's the one they're telling," Henderson said. He glanced over at Rip, his eyes lingering for a second before flicking away. He knew. The skinny freighter at the table shook his head. "This town's gone to hell. First Wakefield, now the Crows. Who's left to run things?" His partner, a heavy-set man with a shaggy beard, grunted. He looked at his cards, then at Henderson. "That's a lot of land. Lot of cattle." He spit a stream of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon. "The brand don't mean much if the owner's in the ground." Henderson grinned. A man with some capital could do well for himself right about now. The skinny freighter looked nervous. "You talk like that, you'll end up like Wakefield." Wakefield was a dog on the Crow's leash, the bearded man said, laying down his cards. "The leash is broke now." Rip finally lifted the glass and drank the whiskey. It was cheap and it burned. He listened to them talk, their voices the sound of buzzards circling. They weren't talking about justice or murder. They were carving up a corpse that was still warm. He pushed the empty glass forward. The bartender refilled it without a word. Rip knew he couldn't stay here. He had one card left to play. It was a mess of ink and desperation, folded in his pocket. But it was all he had. Rip left the second glass of whiskey on the bar untouched. He slid off the stool and walked out of the Golden Slipper, the swinging doors sighing shut behind him. The cool night air felt good on his face. The street was dark, the moon hidden by a high sheet of cloud. At the far end of the block, a single window glowed. The telegraph office. He walked toward it, his boots loud on the boardwalk. He didn't check the shadows. He didn't look over his shoulder, he just walked. The door was unlocked. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The office was a small, hot box of a room that smelled of ozone and stale cigar smoke. A single lamp with a green glass shade cast a bright circle on a desk cluttered with paper. Inside the circle of light, a man sat hunched over a brass telegraph key, his ear cocked to the chattering sounder. He was thin, with a reedy neck and a prominent Adam S. apple that bobbed as he transcribed the incoming message onto a pad. He didn't look up. Rip closed the door. The latch clicked. The man's hand froze on his pencil. He looked up, his eyes adjusting to the figure in the shadows beyond his lamp. He was young, no more than 20, with a face full of pale freckles. "We're closed," the operator said, his voice cracking. Rip stepped into the light. He pulled the Colt from his waistband and laid the barrel on the desk. It made a heavy, solid sound on the wood. The operator stared at the gun, then at Rip's face. All the color drained from his freckles. "You're going to send a message for me," Rip said. The operator swallowed. His Adam's apple did a frantic dance. "Mister, I don't have any money here. Just the company box, and it's locked. I don't want money." Rip pulled the folded ink-stained paper from his pocket and flattened it on the desk next to the gun. "I want you to send a message to the U.S. Marshal's office in Fort Smith, and to every sheriff in a 100-mile circle." The operator looked at the paper. He squinted at the jagged, broken words. "Luke's Evelyn, walk." He looked back at Rip, his expression a mixture of terror and confusion. "This is a confession," Rip said. "From Evelyn Crowe. Written just before he died. It was a lie, but he said it like it was the truest thing in the world. He cleared me." The operator licked his lips. It doesn't say that, it says enough." Rip nudged the Colt a half-inch forward. "Now, are you going to send my message, or am I going to have to find someone who will?" The boy stared at the gun, then nodded, a quick, jerky motion. "To all lawmen, regarding the warrant for Rip Campbell. Evelyn Crowe has confirmed Campbell acted in self-defense in the killing of Lucas Crowe." He paused. "Stop. New sentence. Investigation closed by order of Blackridge authorities." "Stop." The operator's hand trembled as he reached for the telegraph key. His fingers hovered over the brass knob. "Read it back," Rip said. The boy's voice was a whisper. "To all lawmen, regarding warrant for Rip Campbell, Evelyn Crowe confirmed self-defense, killing of Lucas Crowe." "Stop. Investigation closed by order of Blackridge authorities." "Stop. Send it," Rip said. The operator took a deep breath and began to tap the key. The sounder on the other side of the desk began to click and chatter, a mechanical voice speaking Rip's words into the long, dark wire. Click clack click, dot dash 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 dot. The sound filled the small room. Rip watched the boy's fingers, watched the sweat bead on his forehead and run down his temple. He sent the message, his rhythm fast and sure despite his fear. He'd done this 1,000 times. He was a professional. When he finished, he lifted his hand from the key. The silence that followed was louder than the clicking had been. "That's it," the boy whispered. "That's it." Rip picked up the Colt. He didn't point it. He just held it. Sit there for an hour. Don't touch that key. Don't go to the door. You understand? The operator nodded, his eyes fixed on the gun. Rip backed out of the office, pulling the door closed behind him. He stood on the boardwalk for a moment, listening. He heard nothing but the sound of his own lie, clicking its way across the territory. Rip walked away from the telegraph office, the click-clack of the key still echoing in his head. He didn't feel free. He felt like a man who just signed a promissory note with a name that wasn't his. It might buy him a day, maybe two. He found himself at the edge of town, near the public corral. A half-dozen tired-looking horses stood hip-shot in the dusty enclosure, their heads hanging low in the dark. One of them, a rangy buckskin, reminded him of a horse he'd won in a card game in Laredo. He'd ridden that horse for 6 months, drifting from one ranch job to the next, always one step ahead of a past that was gaining on him. He'd sold it for a train ticket and a new suit of clothes, thinking he could buy a different kind of life. It hadn't worked. He was still the same man, just with thinner soles on his boots. Freedom wasn't a place you rode to. It was just the space between walls. He'd knocked down a few of Blackridge's walls tonight, but he knew they'd just built new ones, farther out. He turned his back on the corral and headed for the shadows of the livery to find the horse he'd stolen. Inside the telegraph office, the operator, whose name was Sam, sat frozen on his stool. He listened until the sound of Rip Campbell's boots had faded completely into the night. He counted to 100, his lips moving silently. Then he counted to 100 again. He was still breathing in shallow little sips, like a man afraid the air was poisoned. His hands shook. The barrel of that Colt had looked as wide as a train tunnel. He'd done what the man said. He'd sent the lie. It was out there now, singing on the wire. But Sam was good at his job. He was a company man, and company men followed procedure. He thought about the message log. Every transmission was recorded. That lie, with his operator's sign-off on it, would be there forever. He thought about what would happen when a real marshal showed up and found 2 fresh corpses and a confession written by a ghost. They'd come looking for the man who sent the message. His fear of the man with the gun was a hot, sharp thing. But his fear of the consequences of the company, of the law, was a cold, heavy weight that settled in his gut. He slid off his stool and crept to the door. He pressed his ear against the wood. Nothing. He cracked it open a sliver and peered out into the empty, dark street. He saw no one. He darted back to his desk, his heart hammering against his ribs. He sat down, and his fingers found the brass key. They felt sure and steady now, moving with a purpose that pushed the fear away. He didn't send a new message. That would be too obvious, too easy to trace back. He opened his logbook to the entry he had just made. Next to the official sign-off, he tapped out 3 more letters. A quiet addition to the record of the night's traffic. QSC query. Suspect, coerced. It wasn't a message. It was a footnote. A poison pill slipped into the official record, a flag for the next operator down the line who knew the company codes. A whisper on the wire that said the last transmission was a lie told at the end of a gun. He lifted his hand, the click of the key echoing in the silence. Then he slumped back in his chair, suddenly exhausted. He pulled the lamp closer and went back to his log, his pen scratching in the quiet, as if he were just another operator on just another night, waiting for the sun to come up. The horse he'd taken was still in the last stall of the livery, right where he'd left it. It was a good-sized roan with intelligent eyes, and it had stood quiet through the fire and the shouting. Rip ran a hand down its neck. The animal didn't flinch. He found the saddle and blankets slung over a partition. He worked quickly, his movements economical and practiced. He cinched the saddle tight, checked the stirrup leathers, and fitted the bit into the horse's mouth. The small sounds of his work, the squeak of leather, the jingle of the bridle were loud in the smoky silence of the barn. Before he mounted, he reached into his coat pocket. His fingers closed around the engraved silver watch and the folded, stiff paper of the letter. Lucas Crowe's things. The beginning of it all. He pulled them out and looked at them in the gloom. The watch wasn't ticking. The letter was just a piece of paper, the words on it meaningless to him. They didn't feel like trophies. They felt like rocks he'd been forced to carry. He shoved them back into his pocket. He led the roan out into the street. The sky in the west was a bruised purple, the sun a sliver of molten orange bleeding out behind the distant mesas. Long distorted shadows stretched from every building, making the town look like a broken skeleton. A few faces appeared in windows as he rode down the main street. They were pale ovals in the dim light, watching him pass. No one came out. The doors to the saloon and the mercantile and the jailhouse were all closed. He passed the gallows, a stark silhouette against the dying light. Wakefield's body was gone. Slade's was gone. The street was clean. But the air was thick with what had happened. He could feel the town holding its breath, waiting to see which way the first boot would fall, now that the Crows were gone. He didn't look back. He kept his eyes on the open country ahead. He nudged the roan into a steady trot, leaving the last buildings of Blackridge behind. The land opened up, vast and empty. The wind picked up, whispering through the sagebrush. For a moment, out of the corner of his eye, he saw a rider keeping pace with him, a dark shape on a dark horse. He turned his head. There was nothing there but the shadow of a yucca plant, its arms reaching. He kept riding. The face of the shifty stranger by the campfire flashed in his mind. Then Boone, tumbling from his horse. Cale, with his surprised look in the alley. Slade, Evelyn, Harlan, a withered thing in a silk bed. They weren't ghosts. They were just mile markers on a road he was still on. The sun finally slipped below the horizon, and the world went from purple to a deep star-pricked black. He was just a solitary figure moving through the immense darkness. The only sound, the steady rhythm of his horse's hooves on the hard-packed earth. He was away. That's all that mattered. For now. He rode for 4 days, pushing the roan hard, then easing up, letting it graze in patches of dry grass. He slept in washes and rock shelters, never building a fire. He ate the last of his jerky and drank from his canteen until it was light and hollow. The world was rock and sky, and the steady, plodding rhythm of the horse. Blackridge was a bad dream he was trying to outrun on the 5th day. He saw the ranch. It was just a low-slung adobe house, a corral, and a windmill turning slow circles in the afternoon haze. A hand-painted sign on the fence read "Help Wanted." He rode past it. He needed supplies before he needed a job. Another 10 miles brought him to a town called Perdition. It wasn't much more than a wide spot in the road with a general store, a blacksmith, and a cantina. He tied the roan to the hitching post in front of the store and went inside. The place smelled of coffee beans and leather and dust. An old man behind the counter was weighing out flour for a woman with a baby on her hip. Rip nodded to them and moved deeper into the store, picking up what he needed: a sack of coffee, bacon, a small bag of beans. He was heading back to the counter when he saw it, nailed to a wooden support beam next to a notice about a town dance. It was a fresh sheet of paper, the ink still dark. Wanted for MORDR. There was a crude drawing of a man with a square jaw and dark hair. It didn't look much like him, but it was close enough. Below the drawing, the words were stark and clear. Rip Campbell wanted in connection with the deaths of Deputy Cale, Slade, Evelyn Crowe, and Harlan Crowe of Blackridge. The message he'd sent was gone, erased. His lie hadn't held. The wire had whispered a different story behind his back. The law wasn't a blind fool he could trick with a few lines of code. It was a patient animal with a long memory. He stood there for a long moment, the sack of coffee heavy in his hand. The old man at the counter finished with the woman and looked over at him. "Find everything you need." Rip didn't answer. He walked over to the beam, tore the poster from the nail, and folded it neatly. He walked to the counter and placed the poster down next to his supplies. The storekeeper looked at the paper, then up at Rip's face. His eyes widened slightly, a flicker of recognition. He said nothing. "I'll take this, too," Rip said. He paid for his things, his movements unhurried. He tucked the folded poster into his coat pocket with the watch and the letter. He walked out of the store, untied the roan, and mounted up. He didn't ride out of town. He rode back the way he came, toward the ranch with the "Help Wanted" sign. That night, he made a small fire in a dry creek bed a few miles from the ranch house. The flames felt good in the cold desert air. He made coffee and fried a piece of bacon. When he was done, he took out the wanted poster. He unfolded it and looked at the drawing of his face. At the list of his sins, he held it to the fire. The paper curled, turned brown, and then caught, the flame consuming his name first. He watched it burn until it was nothing but a black, fluttering ash that the wind caught and scattered into the darkness. He finished his coffee, put out the fire, and rolled himself in his blanket. He lay there, looking up at the cold, indifferent stars. He wasn't free, he wasn't caught. He was just a man on a road that had no end, with ghosts for mile markers and a new lie to tell in the morning. The sun would come up, and he would ride on